The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty town of Cedar Falls, Nevada, as the westbound locomotive pulled into the station with a piercing whistle that seemed to announce both arrival and judgment. Through the soot-stained window, 23-year-old Catherine Kate Harrison pressed her palm against the warm glass, her heart hammering against her ribs as she searched the platform for the man who had promised to marry her. She clutched a worn leather envelope containing his photograph, his letters, and the train ticket he had purchased for her journey from Pennsylvania. But what the photograph didn't show, what the carefully worded correspondence couldn't reveal, was the fear that had been growing in her chest with every mile westward. Would Henry Morrison accept her when he saw what his mail-order bride truly looked like? Kate's reflection in the window revealed the source of her anxiety: high cheekbones, inherited from her Apache grandmother, skin bronzed by mixed heritage, and dark hair that refused to lie flat in the fashion preferred by proper ladies of 1887. She was beautiful, undeniably so, but her beauty carried the mark of two worlds that rarely found peace with each other. What she didn't know was that this moment of reckoning would lead to the most devastating public humiliation of her life, followed by a journey that would transform her from a woman begging for acceptance into someone who would redefine what it meant to belong in the unforgiving landscape of the American West. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kate Harrison had never imagined that desperation could taste like dust and smell like coal smoke, but as she gathered her belongings from the train compartment, both flavors filled her senses with the bitter reality of her situation. The letter from Henry Morrison lay folded in her reticule, its edges soft from repeated reading during the 4-day journey from Pittsburgh. Seeking a refined lady of good Christian character for marriage, the advertisement had read in the Pennsylvania Gazette. Must be of sound mind and moral standing. Correspondence welcomed from serious inquiries only. H. Morrison, Cedar Falls, Nevada Territory. Kate had responded with careful honesty, though she had chosen her words as precisely as a seamstress, choosing thread. I am of mixed heritage, she had written, with native and European blood. She had mentioned her grandmother's Apache lineage, but had emphasized her education, her Christian upbringing, and her years working as a schoolteacher in a small Pennsylvania town, until the school board had quietly suggested that someone of her background might be better suited to work elsewhere. Henry Morrison's responses had been encouraging, even warm. He wrote of his cattle ranch, of his need for companionship after 2 years of widowerhood, of his belief that character mattered more than circumstance. He had sent money for her passage and a photograph showing a pleasant-faced man with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair. At 35, he seemed mature enough to value substance over surface appearances. The train lurched to a final stop, and Kate steadied herself against the seatback. Through the window, she could see Cedar Falls stretching beyond the station. Platform, a collection of false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support under the Nevada sun. The landscape was harsher than Pennsylvania's rolling green hills, all sagebrush and red rock formations that jutted from the earth like ancient bones. A conductor appeared at her elbow, tipping his cap politely. End of the line, miss. Cedar Falls, Nevada Territory. Kate nodded and allowed him to help her down from the train car, her worn traveling boots meeting the sun-baked planks of the platform. The heat struck her immediately, different from the humid summers she had known back east. This was dry, relentless heat that seemed to leach moisture from the air itself. Her single trunk followed her onto the platform with a solid thud that announced her arrival to anyone within hearing distance. The station was smaller than she had expected, just a wooden building with peeling white paint and a hand-lettered sign reading Cedar Falls, population 623. The surrounding desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mesas and the occasional Joshua tree reaching toward the cloudless sky. Kate adjusted the shawl around her shoulders, conscious of how the fabric framed her face and emphasized the features that marked her mixed heritage as clearly as if she wore a sign. She had inherited her grandmother's striking bone structure, her father's height, and her mother's green eyes, a combination that had drawn both admiration and suspicion throughout her life. She had written to Henry Morrison honestly about her background, though she had been strategic in her phrasing. Her grandmother, Singing Bird, had been full Apache, taken from her people during a cavalry raid, and eventually married to Kate's Irish grandfather, a frontier trader who had seen past. Her heritage to the remarkable woman beneath. Their daughter, Kate's mother, had inherited enough of her mother's features to face constant questions about her ancestry. Questions that had followed Kate throughout her own life. Now, standing in the oppressive Nevada heat with dust settling on her traveling dress, Kate searched the sparse crowd gathered around the station for a man matching Henry Morrison's description. Her eyes found him near a hitching post where several horses stood switching their tails against persistent flies. Was taller than his photograph had suggested, with broad shoulders and the weathered hands of a man who worked his own land. His grey hair was visible beneath a black hat, and his clothes spoke of prosperity. Good boots, a well-tailored coat despite the heat, a gold watch chain visible across his vest. Kate lifted her hand in a tentative wave, her heart quickening with hope and nervousness. This was the moment she had been preparing for during the long journey west, the moment when her new life would truly begin. Henry Morrison approached with confident strides, his boots striking the platform with purpose. As he drew closer, Kate could see that he was indeed handsome in a rugged way, with pale blue eyes that swept over her with obvious assessment. But something in his expression shifted as he took in her appearance, his confident smile faltering, as if he had been expecting someone entirely different. Miss Harrison. His voice carried a slight drawl that was pleasant enough, but Kate detected an edge of uncertainty that made her stomach clench. Yes, Mr. Morrison. I'm so pleased to finally meet you. Kate stepped forward with her best smile, extending her hand in greeting. She had practiced this moment during the journey, had imagined herself poised and gracious, worthy of the respect any prospective bride deserved. Henry Morrison did not take her offered hand. Instead, he removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair, his pale eyes traveling from her dark hair to her bronzed skin to the distinctive shape of her features that spoke of her Apache grandmother's legacy. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, broken only by the distant sound of the train preparing for its next departure. A small crowd had begun to gather on the platform, drawn by the obvious tension of the scene unfolding before them. Kate became aware of whispered conversations, of curious stares from other passengers who had disembarked from the train. An elderly woman in a feathered hat shook her head with obvious disapproval. Two men near the freight office had stopped their conversation to watch the drama with the fascination people reserved for public disasters. There's been some misunderstanding, Henry Morrison said finally, his voice carefully controlled, as if he were trying not to cause a scene. In your letters, you mentioned mixed heritage, but you didn't specify. He gestured vaguely at her face, unable or unwilling to say the words directly. Kate felt the familiar cold dread that had plagued her since childhood whenever someone looked at her and saw only her grandmother's Apache blood. I told you I was of mixed heritage, Mr. Morrison. I was honest about my background. Mixed heritage could mean anything, he replied, his voice growing louder as if he wanted the gathering crowd to hear his justification clearly. Irish and German, English and Scottish, not... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. Not Indian blood. The words hit Kate like a physical blow, though she had been expecting them since the moment she saw his expression change. She had known this moment might come, had dreaded it throughout the journey west. But Henry Morrison's correspondence had seemed so kind, so accepting of her honesty about her background. She had allowed herself to hope that perhaps here, in the vast openness of Nevada territory, her mixed blood might matter less than her character. "I understand your concern," Kate said quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Perhaps we could speak privately, away from—" "There's nothing to discuss," Henry Morrison interrupted, his voice now carrying clearly across the platform. "I run a respectable ranch, Miss Harrison. I employ good Christian men who work hard and expect their boss to maintain certain standards. I can't bring home a squaw and expect them to respect her as the lady of the house." The word squaw struck Kate like a slap across the face. She had heard it before, whispered behind hands or spat with deliberate cruelty, but never applied to her so publicly, so casually. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she forced herself to stand straighter, to meet his gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. "I'm not a squaw, Mr. Morrison," she said clearly, her voice carrying despite the tremor she felt in her chest. "I'm a Christian woman, educated and refined. I can read and write in 2 languages. I taught school for 3 years in Pennsylvania. I attend church every Sunday, and I've never lived among any tribal people. You can paint yourself with all the civilization you want," Henry Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying across the platform for all to hear. "But blood tells, doesn't it? And I won't have Apache blood in my house or bearing my children." Several people in the crowd murmured agreement. Kate heard someone say, "Quite right too," and another voice added, "Can't trust them people." The elderly woman with the feathered hat nodded approvingly, as if Henry Morrison had made a particularly wise decision. Kate's hands trembled as she reached into her reticule and withdrew his letters, the pages worn soft from repeated reading during the long journey west. "You wrote to me about loneliness," she said, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "You said you wanted someone to share your life, someone who understood hardship and could appreciate the beauty of this land. You said character mattered more than circumstances of birth." Henry Morrison glanced at the letters but didn't take them, as if touching them might somehow contaminate him. "That was before I knew what you really were." "What I really am," Kate said, her voice growing stronger as anger began to override her humiliation, "is a woman who traveled 2,000 miles to meet a man who seemed kind and decent in his correspondence. What I really am is someone who sold everything she owned for train fare because she believed your words about wanting a true partnership." For a moment, Henry Morrison looked almost ashamed. His eyes flickered away from hers, and Kate thought she saw a hint of the man who had written those warm, hopeful letters. But then someone in the crowd called out, "You tell her, Henry!" and his expression hardened again. "I'm sorry you made the journey for nothing," he said with forced politeness, "but I'm sure you understand that a man has to think about his reputation, his business associates. There's nothing personal in it. Everything about it was personal." But Kate didn't waste her breath pointing that out. She had heard the finality in his tone, seen the closed expression on his face. The crowd was watching with the fascination people reserved for public disasters, waiting to see if she would break down, if she would beg or argue or make a scene that would provide them with gossip for weeks to come. Instead, Kate Harrison gathered what remained of her dignity around her like armor. She picked up the handle of her trunk, testing its weight, then looked Henry Morrison directly in the eye. "You're right about one thing," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the platform. "There has been a misunderstanding. I thought I was corresponding with a man of honor and character. I was wrong about that, just as you were wrong about me." She turned away from him, away from the crowd with their curious stares and whispered comments, and began walking toward the main street of Cedar Falls, Her trunk was heavy, far too heavy to carry easily, but she pulled it behind her with determined steps, the wheels bumping over the uneven planks of the platform. Behind her, she heard Henry Morrison call out, "The next eastbound train leaves tomorrow morning at 6. But Kate didn't turn around. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to retreat at the first sign of adversity. She had no idea what she would do or where she would go, but she would not give him the satisfaction of watching her board a train back to the poverty and hopelessness she had left behind in Pennsylvania. The main street of Cedar Falls stretched. Before her, a dusty thoroughfare lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to shimmer in the desert heat. A few people moved along the wooden sidewalks, going about their afternoon business, but most had probably witnessed the scene at the train station or heard about it already. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when it concerned rejection and scandal involving a woman of mixed blood. As Kate pulled her trunk down the dusty street, she found herself studying each face she passed, wondering if they had been part of the crowd at the station, wondering what they thought of the half-Apache woman dragging her worldly possessions through their town like a refugee from her own shattered dreams. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kate Harrison had never realized how heavy shame could be until she dragged her trunk down the main street of Cedar Falls, feeling the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations following her like shadows. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden sidewalks, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the dry desert air. Every step felt like a declaration of her refusal to surrender, even as her practical mind catalogued the impossibility of her situation. She passed the First National Bank of Cedar Falls, its brick facade speaking of stability and prosperity that seemed as foreign to her current circumstances as the moon. Through the window, she glimpsed men in fine suits conducting business with the casual confidence of people who belonged, who had never questioned their right to exist in civilized society. The contrast with her own situation struck her like a physical blow. A general store occupied the next building, its windows displaying bolts of calico, household goods, and supplies that spoke of ordinary domestic life. Kate slowed her pace, studying the merchandise with the calculating eye of someone whose resources had suddenly become finite. She had exactly $17.34 in her purse, her life savings after purchasing the train ticket that had brought her to this moment of crisis. The store's proprietor, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, emerged from behind his counter as she lingered outside his establishment. His gaze traveled from her travel-worn dress to her distinctive features to the trunk she was pulling behind her, and Kate saw recognition dawn in his pale eyes. "You're the one from the train station," he said, though it wasn't really a question. Word had already spread through the small community with the speed that only scandal could achieve. Kate straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. I'm looking for lodging and honest work, if either are available." The storekeeper's expression grew uncomfortable, and he glanced around as if checking to see who might be observing their conversation. "Well, now, that's a difficult situation. Most folks around here—" He trailed off, apparently unable to find words that were both honest and polite. "Most folks around here don't want to associate with someone of my heritage," Kate finished quietly. "I understand, but I'm willing to work hard for fair wages, and I won't cause any trouble for anyone who's willing to give me a chance." The man shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly torn between practical considerations and social pressure. "It's not that simple, miss. This is a small town and people talk. If I were to hire someone like you, it might hurt my business with other customers." Kate had expected this response, but hearing it stated so bluntly still stung. Someone like me, she repeated. You mean someone who can read and write, who's taught school for 3 years, who's never stolen so much as a penny from anyone? You... No, that's not what I mean, the storekeeper said, his discomfort evident. It's about what people expect, what they're comfortable with. Kate nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her chest like a cold sunrise. This wasn't about her qualifications or character. This was about an entire community's determination to maintain boundaries that had nothing to do with individual worth. I see, she said simply. Thank you for your honesty. As she continued down the street, Kate began to understand the true scope of her isolation. She wasn't just facing individual prejudice, she was confronting a systematic exclusion that would make survival nearly impossible. Every business, every potential employer, every possible source of income would be filtered through the lens of her Apache heritage. The Nevada House Hotel occupied a prominent corner lot, its 2-story frame construction suggesting rooms that might be within her budget. Kate approached the front desk with dwindling hope, where a matronly woman with greying hair and suspicious eyes looked up from her ledger book. I'd like to inquire about a room, Kate said politely. Something modest, by the week if possible. The woman's gaze travelled over Kate's appearance with obvious disapproval. We're full up, she said curtly, though Kate had noticed several room keys hanging behind the desk. Perhaps something will open up in a few days, Kate pressed gently. I'm willing to pay in advance. I said we're full, the woman repeated, her voice growing louder, and likely to stay that way for the foreseeable future. Kate understood. The Nevada House Hotel would never have a vacancy for someone like her. Regardless of her ability to pay or her conduct as a guest, she was being systematically excluded from the basic necessities of survival. Outside the hotel, Kate stood on the wooden sidewalk and took stock of her situation with the grim clarity that desperation could provide. She had less than $20, no place to stay, no prospects for employment, and a community that had already decided she was unwelcome. The next eastbound train wouldn't leave until morning, but even if she wanted to retreat to Pennsylvania, she lacked the funds for a return ticket. The sound of piano music drifted from a nearby saloon, mixing with laughter and conversation that spoke of people enjoying themselves without the weight of rejection and isolation. Kate found herself envying their casual happiness, their assumption that they belonged in whatever space they occupied. A young woman emerged from the millinery shop across the street, her fashionable dress and confident bearing marking her as someone of local importance. She paused when she saw Kate, her eyes narrowing with the calculating assessment that preceded gossip. You're the Indian girl who tried to trick Henry Morrison, she said loudly enough for passers-by to hear. I'm Mrs. Rebecca Thompson. My husband owns the lumber mill. Kate felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied public confrontation, but she forced herself to respond calmly. I'm Kate Harrison. I didn't trick anyone. I was honest about my background in all my correspondence. Honest. Mrs. Thompson's laugh was sharp and bitter. You deliberately misled a decent man about your breeding. Do you have any idea what kind of scandal that creates for a respectable family? A small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the raised voices and the promise of drama. Kate recognized some faces from the train station, people who had witnessed her initial humiliation and were now eager for a sequel. I describe myself as being of mixed heritage, Kate replied carefully, trying to keep her voice level. If Mr. Morrison had questions about my ancestry, he could have asked for clarification. Mixed heritage, Mrs. Thompson repeated mockingly. As if that excuse is bringing savage blood into civilized society. Your people have been murdering and scalping decent folks for generations, and now you want to waltz into our town and demand acceptance. Kate felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. My people, she said with quiet dignity, include the Irish grandfather who built a trading post with his own hands, the Apache grandmother who survived the destruction of her entire way of life, and the mother who raised me to be Christian and educated. If you can't see past my blood to judge me by my character, that says more about you than it does about me." The slap came without warning. Mrs. Thompson's gloved hand struck Kate's cheek with enough force to snap her head to the side, the sound echoing off the false-fronted buildings. The crowd murmured with approval and excitement, as if Kate's response had justified the violence. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Mrs. Thompson hissed. "You forget your place, girl." Kate's cheek burned, but she didn't lift her hand to touch it. She wouldn't give these people the satisfaction of seeing her breakdown. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and looked Mrs. Thompson directly in the eye. "My place," she said clearly, "is wherever I choose to make it. And it won't be determined by women who think their breeding gives them the right to strike others. In the street." She stepped around the group and continued on her way, feeling their shocked stares following her down the sidewalk. The victory felt hollow, though. The encounter had driven home the reality of her situation with brutal clarity. She wasn't just facing individual prejudice. She was up against the entire social structure of the community, a wall of combined hostility that seemed impossible to breach. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Kate found herself at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to sagebrush and open desert. The vastness of the landscape was both beautiful and terrifying, offering freedom from human judgment, but also the promise of death for anyone unprepared for its harsh demands. She sat on a large boulder beside the road, her trunk at her feet, and allowed herself, for the first time since stepping off the train, to fully absorb what had happened. She had been rejected, publicly humiliated, and systematically excluded from the basic necessities of survival. The future she had imagined, a home of her own, a husband who valued her, perhaps children who would grow up with more acceptance than she had known, all of that had crumbled in the space of a few cruel hours. But she was not defeated. Kate Harrison had survived the death of both parents, the loss of her teaching position, and the grinding poverty that had driven her west in the first place. She had faced down Mrs. Thompson's violence with dignity intact. She would find a way. To survive this, too, the desert evening was beginning to cool, and stars were starting to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, wild and free and utterly self-possessed. Kate smiled at the sound, recognizing a kindred spirit. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve. But tonight, under the infinite Nevada sky, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Pennsylvania. A sense of possibility that belonged entirely to her, independent of anyone else's approval or acceptance. She was Kate Harrison, daughter of 3 proud peoples, survivor of countless small cruelties and one large betrayal. And she would not be broken by the narrow minds and cruel hearts of Cedar Falls, Nevada. As the night settled around her, Kate began to plan. Not for retreat, but for the kind of survival that would prove her worth to herself, if to no one else. The first night Kate Harrison spent in Nevada territory was not in a comfortable hotel bed or even a modest boarding house room, but wrapped in her traveling cloak beneath the overhang of the Cedar Falls depot, using her trunk as a pillow, while desert winds whispered promises and threats through the sagebrush. She had discovered that $17 could buy many things, but not acceptance in a town determined to reject her. As dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold, Kate woke to the sound of activity stirring throughout the settlement. The early morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and bacon from breakfast fires, reminding her that she hadn't eaten a proper meal since the previous morning on the train. Her stomach cramped with hunger, But more pressing was her need to find some form of shelter before the Nevada sun made the depot platform uninhabitable. She rose stiffly, brushing dust from her traveling dress and attempting to restore some semblance of respectability to her appearance. A woman's reputation was fragile enough without adding the scandal of sleeping rough to her list of social transgressions. As she folded her cloak and secured it in her trunk, Kate noticed she was being observed. An elderly man sat on a wooden crate near the freight office, whittling a piece of pine with methodical precision. His weathered face spoke of decades spent under the desert sun, and his clothes marked him as someone who worked with his hands rather than conducting business in fine offices. But his eyes held intelligence, and something that looked remarkably like sympathy. "Morning, miss," he said without looking up from his carving. "Rough night for sleeping outdoors." Kate straightened her shoulders, preparing for another confrontation or dismissal. "Good morning." Yes, it was rather uncomfortable. "Name's Walter Jenkins," the man continued, still focused on his whittling. "Been the station master here for going on 12 years. Seen all kinds of folks come through Cedar Falls, some welcomed and some not so much." Kate studied his weathered features, trying to determine whether this was kindness or merely curiosity. "I'm Kate Harrison." Walter nodded, finally looking up from his carving. "Heard about your situation yesterday. Town's been buzzing about it since the afternoon train pulled out." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "My wife Martha runs a small boarding house about a mile outside town. Nothing fancy, mind you, but clean and honest. She might have a room available." Kate's heart leaped with desperate hope, but experience had taught her to be cautious. "Mr. Jenkins, I appreciate your kindness, but I should be honest about my circumstances. I have limited funds, and most people in this area seem uncomfortable with my heritage." Walter's weathered hands never paused in their whittling. "Martha and I came west in '68 after the war. Seen enough of what hatred can do to last several lifetimes. We judge folks by how they conduct themselves, not by who their grandparents happen to be." The simple declaration nearly brought tears to Kate's eyes. After 24 hours of systematic rejection, the offer of basic human decency felt like a miracle. "I can pay $2 a week," Kate said carefully, "and I'm willing to work for additional room and board. I can cook, clean, keep books, teach children if anyone needs tutoring." Walter smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Martha's been saying she needs help with the washing and garden work. Her arthritis has been acting up something fierce this summer. $2 a week plus help around the place sounds fair to me." As Walter hitched up a wagon to transport Kate and her belongings to the boarding house, she felt the first genuine hope she had experienced since stepping off the train. The ride through the Nevada countryside revealed a landscape both harsh and beautiful, with distant mountains, framing valleys, dotted with Joshua trees and hardy desert plants that had learned to thrive in conditions that would kill gentler vegetation. The Jenkins boarding house sat in a small grove of cottonwood trees, near a seasonal creek, its adobe walls and red tile roof speaking of Mexican architectural influence adapted to the desert climate. It was modest but well-maintained, with a vegetable garden that showed signs of careful tending, despite the challenging growing conditions. Martha Jenkins proved to be a small woman with grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that bore the calluses of hard work. Her greeting was warm but reserved, the caution of someone who had learned to judge character carefully before extending full trust. "Walter tells me you're looking for honest work and decent lodging," Martha said, as she showed Kate to a small but clean room at the back of the house. "I'll be plain with you, we don't get involved in town politics or social nonsense. You conduct yourself properly, do your share of the work, and you'll be treated fairly here." The room was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the desert toward the distant mountains. After sleeping on a train platform, it seemed like luxury beyond measure. "Mrs. Jenkins," Kate said carefully, "I want you to understand my situation clearly. I'm half Apache, and the people in town have made their feelings about that quite plain. If my staying here causes problems for your business—" Martha's expression grew firm. "Miss Harrison, I've been running this boarding house for 8 years. I've housed miners, cowboys, traveling salesmen, and settlers heading further west. Some have been white as fresh milk and meaner than rattlesnakes. Others have had mixed blood and hearts as pure as mountain streams. I've learned that the color of a person's skin tells you nothing about the content of their character." That first week at the Jenkins boarding house established routines that brought Kate her first taste of peace since leaving Pennsylvania. She rose before dawn to help Martha prepare breakfast for their handful of guests, mostly traveling men who kept to themselves, and treated Kate with polite indifference. After the morning meal, she tended the vegetable garden, learning to coax life from soil that seemed more dust than earth. In the afternoons, she helped with laundry and mending, work that reminded her of her mother's lessons about finding dignity in honest labor. The physical activity was exhausting in the desert heat, but it also provided a kind of therapy, allowing her mind to process the trauma of rejection while her hands stayed busy with productive tasks. Evenings brought the most precious gift of all, conversation with people who saw her as a human being rather than a social problem. Walter would share stories of his experiences during the war and the early days of Nevada Territory, while Martha taught Kate practical skills for desert survival, from identifying edible plants to preserving water during the dry season. "The desert teaches hard lessons," Martha observed one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors. "But they're honest lessons. Out here, what matters is whether you can adapt and survive, not whether your bloodline meets someone else's approval." Kate found herself thinking often about Martha's words as she settled into the rhythm of life. At the boarding house, for the first time since childhood, she was living without the constant weight of other people's judgment, able to simply exist without defending her right to do so. But she also understood that this sanctuary was temporary. She couldn't hide indefinitely on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, surviving on the kindness of the Jenkins family. Eventually, she would need to find permanent work, build relationships with the broader community, create a life that didn't depend on avoiding the prejudices that had driven her from town. The question was whether such a life was possible in a place that had already made its rejection so brutally clear. As Kate lay in her narrow bed each night, listening to the desert wind rustle through the cottonwood trees, she found herself planning not for retreat, but for the kind of strategic advance that would allow her to claim her place in this harsh land on her own terms. She was learning that survival was not just about enduring hardship, but about transforming it into strength. And Kate Harrison was discovering reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. 3 weeks into her stay at the Jenkins boarding house, Kate Harrison made a decision that would test whether Cedar Falls could learn to see past her Apache heritage to the woman she had become. The decision came not from desperation this time, but from a growing confidence born of Martha Jenkins' practical wisdom and Walter's steady encouragement. "You can't build a life by avoiding the world forever," Martha had observed that morning, as they worked together in the garden, harvesting the late summer vegetables that had somehow thrived despite the harsh conditions. "Sooner or later, you'll need to make your own way among people, whether they're ready for you or not." Kate had been thinking the same thing. Her small savings were dwindling, despite the Jenkins' reasonable rates. And more importantly, she was beginning to feel like she was hiding rather than truly living. The sanctuary they had provided was precious, but it wasn't permanent, and it wasn't really hers. The opportunity came in the form of Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a traveling physician who had arrived at the boarding house the previous evening. Dr. Hartwell was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair and the kind of steady competence that came from years of dealing with medical emergencies on the frontier. She was also, Kate realized with some surprise, the first professional woman she had encountered in Nevada territory. "I understand you were a school teacher back east," Dr. Hartwell said over breakfast, her voice carrying the educated accent of someone from a good family who had chosen an unconventional path. "That suggests you can read and write well, perhaps. Keep organized records?" Kate nodded cautiously, unsure where this conversation was leading. "Yes, ma'am. I taught for 3 years in Pennsylvania and kept all the school's administrative records." Dr. Hartwell studied Kate with intelligent grey eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. "I've been traveling through these territories for 5 years now, providing medical care to communities that can't support a resident physician. It's rewarding work, but the record-keeping and correspondence have become overwhelming. I need an assistant, someone who can help manage the business side of my practice." Kate's pulse quickened with interest, but experience had taught her to be cautious about opportunities that seemed too good to be true. "Dr. Hartwell, I should tell you that I've faced some challenges with acceptance in this community. My heritage has proven to be an obstacle." "Your heritage?" Dr. Hartwell raised an eyebrow. "You mean the fact that you're part Apache?" "Miss Harrison, I've delivered babies for Paiute women, set broken bones for Mexican miners, and treated bullet wounds for cowboys of every imaginable background. If I started judging people by their ancestry, I'd have precious few patients left." The matter-of-fact way she dismissed the issue that had caused Kate so much pain was both refreshing and slightly bewildering. "You're not concerned about what people might say about employing someone like me?" Dr. Hartwell laughed, a sound of genuine amusement rather than mockery. "Miss Harrison, I'm a woman practicing medicine on the frontier. Half the people I meet think I'm an abomination against nature's design. The other half are too grateful for competent medical care to worry about social conventions. Adding an assistant with mixed heritage to my sins against propriety seems rather minor in comparison." Kate found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "What would the position involve?" "Travel, primarily. We'd visit mining camps, ranches, and small settlements throughout the territory. You'd help me organize medical supplies, maintain patient records, assist with basic procedures when needed. The pay would be $12 a month, plus room and board, and you'd see country that most people never dream of exploring." $12 a month was less than Kate had earned teaching school, but it was steady income with the possibility of gaining valuable experience. More importantly, it offered the chance to build a life based on useful work, rather than constant negotiation with prejudice. "When would you need an answer?" Kate asked. "We'd leave tomorrow morning if you're interested. There's a mining camp up in the Ruby Mountains that's been requesting medical assistance for 2 months. It's a 3-day ride, and we'd probably spend a week there treating injuries and illnesses that have accumulated." She thought about her grandmother, Singing Bird, who had survived the destruction of her entire way of life and somehow found the strength to build something new with an Irish trader who saw past her Apache identity to the remarkable woman beneath. She thought about her mother, who had faced similar prejudices throughout her life but had still managed to raise a daughter with dignity and education. Both women had taught her that survival sometimes required adapting to circumstances beyond your control, but that adaptation didn't mean surrender. It meant finding ways to thrive despite the obstacles others placed in your path. The next morning, Kate packed her belongings into a worn leather saddlebag and prepared to join Dr. Hartwell on her circuit through the Nevada wilderness. Martha, Jenkins helped her select practical clothing for the journey, divided skirts that would allow her to ride astride, sturdy boots, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the desert sun. "You're making the right choice," Martha said, as they secured Kate's medical supply satchel to her saddle. "Hiding never built character or created opportunities. This work will give you a chance to prove yourself where it matters most." Walter. Jenkins had provided Kate with a gentle mare named Sage, whose steady temperament and sure footing made her ideal for mountain travel. As Kate settled into the saddle, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of the emotions she had experienced boarding the train in Pennsylvania. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't running toward an uncertain future built on someone else's promises. She was choosing her own path, building her own opportunities, creating her own definition of what it meant to belong in this harsh and beautiful country. Dr. Hartwell rode a sturdy gelding with the easy competence of someone who had spent years in the saddle. Her medical supplies were efficiently packed in weatherproof bags, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. "The Ruby Mountain camp is rough," she warned, as they headed north toward the distant peaks. "Mostly single men working dangerous jobs for companies that care more about profits than safety. We'll see injuries that would make a city doctor faint, and we'll treat them with whatever supplies we can carry." Kate nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I'm prepared for hard work, Dr. Hartwell. It can't be more challenging than what I've already faced." Dr. Hartwell glanced at her with approval. "I suspect you're right about that. Anyone who can survive what you've been through in Cedar Falls has the kind of resilience this work requires." As they rode toward the mountains, Kate found herself thinking not about the challenges that lay ahead, but about the strange turns her life had taken. 3 weeks ago, she had been a desperate woman rejected at a train station, facing systematic exclusion from an entire community. Now she was riding through some of the most beautiful country on earth, employed in work that could help people, building skills that would serve her regardless of what prejudices she might encounter. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it wasn't complete. She still carried the wounds of rejection, still felt the sting of being judged by her ancestry rather than her character. But she was beginning to understand that healing didn't require the approval of people who were determined to withhold. Sometimes healing meant leaving those people behind and finding your own way forward. 1 mile at a time, through country that judged you only by your ability to meet its honest challenges. The Ruby Mountains rose ahead of them like a promise of possibility, and Kate Harrison rode toward them with her chin high and her heart, for the first time in months, full of hope. The mining camp at Ruby Mountain existed in a world entirely removed from the social conventions that had tormented Kate in Cedar Falls. Perched on a rocky ledge 8,000 feet above sea level, the settlement consisted of rough wooden buildings, canvas tents, and the kind of desperate men who came to such places when civilization had either rejected them or they had rejected it. Kate's first glimpse of the camp came as she and Dr. Hartwell crested a narrow mountain pass after 3 days of hard riding through terrain that shifted from desert sage to pine forest to bare granite peaks. The sight that greeted them was both sobering and oddly liberating, a place where survival depended entirely on competence, where prejudice was a luxury few could afford, when accidents and disease struck without regard for ancestry or social standing. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Dr. Hartwell muttered as they surveyed the camp below. "That's worse than I expected." Kate followed her gaze to what appeared to be a makeshift hospital tent, with several men lying on stretchers outside, their groans audible even from their elevated position. Smoke rose from multiple cook fires, but also from what looked like the smoldering remains of a collapsed mine shaft. The air itself seemed thick with dust and the sound of men in pain. Cave-in 3 days ago, explained Jake Morrison, the camp foreman who met them at the settlement's edge. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with the kind of deep lines around his eyes that came from squinting into mine shafts and worrying about men under his supervision. "We've got 6 men trapped inside, 4 more with broken bones from the rescue attempts, and half the camp down with what might be cholera or might just be bad water." Dr. Hartwell was already dismounting, her medical bag in hand. "Kate, start organizing the supply packs. We'll need to set up a proper treatment area." Immediately, she turned to Morrison. "How many men total in the camp?" 43 as of yesterday morning, Morrison replied grimly. "Could be fewer now, depending on how the night went." Kate had never seen anything like the organized chaos that followed. Dr. Hartwell moved through the camp with systematic efficiency, triaging patients, barking orders, and performing medical procedures that would have been considered impossible under such primitive conditions. Kate found herself thrust into the role of surgical assistant, supply manager, and sometimes translator for the handful of Mexican and Chinese workers whose English was limited. "Hold this steady while I set the bone," Dr. Hartwell instructed during her treatment of a miner whose leg had been crushed in the cave-in rescue attempt. Kate gripped the man's shoulders while the doctor worked, her own stomach churning at the sight of the compound fracture, but her hands remaining steady. The patient, a young man named Billy Crawford, who couldn't have been more than 20, gripped Kate's arms with desperate strength as Dr. Hartwell manipulated the broken bone back. "Into position." "Jesus, lady, that hurts like hellfire," he gasped. "I know it does," Kate said quietly, meeting his pain-filled eyes. "But Dr. Hartwell is the best physician in the territory. You're going to be able to walk again." Billy's grip relaxed slightly, at her calm confidence. "You talk like you've seen this before." Kate realized with surprise that she was drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I've seen people endure all kinds of hardship and come through stronger." "For it," she said. "Pain doesn't last forever, but giving up does." Over the following week, Kate discovered that the mining camp operated according to rules entirely different from those that governed civilized society. Men who might have crossed the street to avoid her in Cedar Falls now depended on her medical knowledge and steady hands. Her heritage, which had been a source of shame and rejection in town, became an advantage in treating workers who appreciated her grandmother's knowledge of herbal remedies and her ability to communicate with the camp's diverse population. "You know anything about treating infected wounds with desert plants?" asked Chen Wei, one of the Chinese miners whose arm had been gashed during the rescue operations. "The company doctor, he only know white man medicine." Kate found herself drawing on half-remembered lessons from her grandmother, knowledge that had seemed like cultural curiosities in Pennsylvania, but proved invaluable in the harsh conditions of the mining camp. She prepared poultices from plants Dr. Hartwell had shown her during their journey, treatments that combined her grandmother's Apache wisdom with her newfound medical training. The breakthrough moment came on the 4th day, when the rescue team finally broke through to the trapped miners. 2 had died in the collapse, but 4 emerged alive, including the camp's most experienced foreman, whose knowledge was crucial to the operation's survival. As Kate helped treat his injuries, severe dehydration and a dislocated shoulder, she found herself the center of attention in a way she had never experienced. "Miss Kate," said Tom Fletcher, one of the rescued miners, "I heard some of the boys saying you got Indian blood. That true?" Kate tensed, preparing for the familiar rejection, or crude comments that usually followed such questions. Instead, Fletcher continued, "Because if it is, I want to thank your people. My granddaddy always said the Apache knew more about surviving in this country than the rest of us put together. Saved my life these past few days, having someone who understands both worlds." The comment sparked a conversation that revealed how different the frontier was from settled communities. Here, survival trumped social conventions. Men who had fled various forms of civilization's judgment, whether for crimes, debts, or simply their inability to fit into society's expectations, found themselves valuing competence over conformity. "Out here, nobody cares where you came from," explained Sam Rodriguez, a Mexican miner whose own mixed heritage had caused him problems in more established towns. "They care whether you can do the work, whether you'll stand by your partners when things get dangerous, whether you've got the grit to survive when everything goes wrong." Kate began to understand that she had found something rare, a community that judged people by their actions rather than their ancestry, their usefulness rather than their social acceptability. It wasn't that prejudice didn't exist among the miners, but that survival created a different set of priorities. Dr. Hartwell noticed the change in Kate's demeanor as the week progressed. "You're different here," she observed one evening as they sat by their campfire, reviewing the day's medical cases. "More confident, more yourself." Kate considered the observation. "I think it's because for the first time in my life, I'm being judged by what I can do rather than who my grandparents were. These men don't care about my bloodline. They care whether I can help save their lives." "And how does that feel?" Dr. Hartwell asked. Kate smiled, surprising herself with the genuine happiness in the expression. "It feels like freedom." The revelation was both liberating and troubling. Liberating because it showed her that acceptance was possible, that she could find her place in the world if she looked beyond the narrow confines of conventional society. Troubling because it suggested that her struggle in Cedar Falls wasn't about her worth as a person, but about the limitations of people who couldn't see past their own prejudices. As their week at the mining camp drew to a close, Kate found herself reluctant to leave. Not because the conditions were comfortable, the work was exhausting, the living conditions primitive, and the constant presence of danger wearing on the nerves. But because for the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, she felt like she belonged somewhere, like she was valued for who she was, rather than tolerated despite it. "The circuit takes us back through here every few months," Dr. Hartwell mentioned as they prepared to depart. "These men will remember what you did for them. Word spreads in mining country. You'll have a reputation as someone reliable, someone who can be trusted in a crisis." Kate nodded, understanding that the doctor was giving her something more valuable than money, the beginning of a professional reputation that existed independently of her social status or heritage. In a world where competence mattered more than ancestry, she was finally free to prove her worth on her own terms. As they rode away from Ruby Mountain, Kate carried with her not just the satisfaction of work well done, but a new understanding of what was possible for her future. She had found a world where she could thrive, where her mixed heritage was an asset rather than a liability, where her worth was measured by her contributions rather than her conformity to other people's expectations. The question now was whether she could find a way to build a permanent life in this world, or whether she would have to choose between acceptance and conventional society's definition of respectability. But for the first time since stepping off that train in Cedar Falls, Kate Harrison felt like she had choices, real choices based on her own capabilities rather than other people's prejudices. The journey back to Cedar Falls took Kate and Dr. Hartwell through some of the most spectacular country in Nevada territory, but Kate found her thoughts increasingly occupied, not with the landscape, but with what awaited her return. The confidence she had discovered at Ruby Mountain felt fragile now that she was approaching the community that had rejected her so completely. Would the strength she had found in herself survive contact with people who were determined to see her as less than human? Dr. Hartwell seemed to sense her apprehension as they made camp on their final night before reaching the Jenkins boarding house. "You're worried about going back?" she observed as they sat beside their small fire, the desert stars brilliant overhead. Kate nodded, poking at the glowing coals with a stick. At Ruby Mountain, I felt like I finally understood who I could be. But that was with people who had nothing to lose by accepting me. Cedar Falls. She trailed off, remembering the hostility that had driven her from town. Cedar Falls isn't the only community in this territory, Dr. Hartwell pointed out. My circuit covers dozens of settlements, and I can tell you that not all of them share the same narrow-minded attitudes. You've proven yourself capable of valuable work that opens doors that social prejudice tries to keep closed. The next morning brought an unexpected encounter that would change the trajectory of Kate's life once again. As they descended from the mountain trail toward the valley where the Jenkins boarding house lay, they came upon a scene of controlled chaos beside Willow Creek. A dozen cattle stood belly-deep in the muddy water, several of them clearly in distress, while two cowboys worked frantically to extract them from what appeared to be a bog trap. Dr. Hartwell reined in her horse immediately. "Medical emergency," she said tersely, dismounting with practiced efficiency. "Those animals are exhausted, and if those men aren't careful, they'll end up needing medical attention themselves." One of the cowboys looked up at their approach, his face flushed with exertion and frustration. He was perhaps 35 years old, with the lean build and weathered features of someone who spent his life working cattle in difficult country. His clothes marked him as prosperous, good boots, quality leather gear, the kind of horse that cost serious money. But he was working alongside his hired hand with the hands-on dedication that spoke of genuine investment in his animals' welfare. "You folks wouldn't happen to know anything about treating exhausted livestock?" he called out, not pausing in his efforts to free a struggling heifer from the bog. Kate surprised herself by speaking up before Dr. Hartwell could respond. "The animals need to rest and warm up gradually once they're free," she said, dismounting from her own horse. "Shock them with sudden temperature changes and you'll lose them to heart failure." The rancher paused in his work, studying Kate with intelligent brown eyes that held curiosity rather than the suspicion she had grown accustomed to seeing. "You sound like you know cattle." Kate felt heat rise in her cheeks, suddenly aware that she was speaking from knowledge she hadn't realized she possessed. "My grandfather raised cattle in Pennsylvania before the war. Different country, but the principles are the same." Dr. Hartwell was already examining the animals that had been pulled free, her medical training extending to veterinary care when necessary. "Miss Harrison is right about the gradual warming. These animals are hypothermic from standing in cold water for hours. Rush the process and you'll kill them." For the next 2 hours, Kate found herself working alongside the rancher and his hired hand to save the trapped cattle. The work was physically demanding and emotionally intense. Several of the animals were in genuine danger of dying from exhaustion and exposure. But it was also familiar in a way that surprised her, drawing on half-remembered lessons from childhood visits to her grandfather's farm. "You've got good instincts with animals," the rancher observed, as they worked together to warm a shivering calf with blankets and gentle massage. Natural feel for what they need. Kate looked up from her work to find him studying her with an expression of genuine respect. It was so different from the calculating assessments she was used to receiving that it took her a moment to respond. "Animals don't care about bloodlines," she said quietly. "They respond to kindness and competence, nothing else." The rancher's weathered face broke into a smile. "Spoken like someone who understands what matters. I'm James Mitchell, by the way. I run the Circle M Ranch about 10 miles south of Cedar Falls." "Kate Harrison," she replied, bracing herself for the familiar change in his expression when he connected her name with the scandal that had swept through the local community. But James Mitchell's expression didn't change, suggesting either that he hadn't heard about her situation or that he had heard and didn't care. "Miss Harrison, Dr. Hartwell, I can't thank you enough for your help today. These cattle represent most of my breeding stock for next year. Losing them would have set me back 5 years or more." Dr. Hartwell was packing her medical supplies back into her saddlebags. All in a day's work, Mr. Mitchell, though I should mention that Miss Harrison deserves most of the credit. Her knowledge of cattle care was exactly what the situation required. James. Mitchell studied Kate with renewed interest. Miss Harrison, if you don't mind my asking, what brings you to this part of Nevada? Are you planning to settle in the area? Kate felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied questions about her future. How could she explain that she had come west as a mail-order bride, been publicly rejected for her heritage, and was now trying to build some kind of life from the wreckage of her original plans? Miss Harrison works with me, Dr. Hartwell interjected, smoothly. She's my medical assistant, and a very capable one. We've just returned from treating injuries at the Ruby Mountain mining camp. Medical work, James Mitchell mused. That's demanding profession out here. Takes someone with real backbone to handle the kinds of emergencies you must see. James Mitchell's eyes sharpened with interest. Actually, Miss Harrison, I've been looking for someone to help me rebuild my operation. The cattle business requires more than just cowboy skills. It needs someone who can keep detailed records, manage breeding schedules, correspond with buyers. Someone with education and organizational abilities. Kate's heart began to race. Was he offering her work? Real work, not charity disguised as employment, but a genuine position that would use her abilities? The position would include living in quarters on the ranch, James Mitchell continued, apparently encouraged by her obvious interest. Separate cottage, completely respectable. The pay would be $15 a month plus room and board, and there would be opportunities to learn all aspects of ranch management. Kate glanced at Dr. Hartwell, who was watching the exchange with an expression of barely concealed approval. $15 a month was more than she had earned with the doctor, and the chance to learn ranch management could lead to real independence. Mr. Mitchell, Kate said carefully, I should be honest about my situation. I'm half Apache, and that has caused difficulties with acceptance in some communities. If my heritage would create problems for your business relationships, James Mitchell's expression grew serious, but not hostile. Miss Harrison, I've spent 20 years building my reputation in this territory based on the quality of my cattle and the reliability of my word. Anyone who wants to do business with me will have to accept that I choose my employees based on their abilities, not their ancestry. The simple declaration nearly brought tears to Kate's eyes. After months of having her worth questioned and diminished, because of her bloodline, here was a man offering her work based purely on what he had observed of her competence. There is one thing you should know, James Mitchell added, his expression growing slightly uncomfortable. I'm a widower, Miss Harrison. My wife died 2 years ago in a cholera epidemic. Some people might consider it improper for an unmarried woman to work so closely with a bachelor rancher, regardless of the separate living arrangements. Kate understood the social implications he was describing, but she also understood that this might be her best opportunity to build the kind of independent life she had been dreaming of since leaving Pennsylvania. Mr. Mitchell, she said firmly, I believe my reputation should be based on my conduct and character, not on other people's assumptions about impropriety. If you're willing to judge me by my work rather than social conventions, then I would be very interested in discussing the position. James Mitchell's smile was warm and genuine. Then let's consider it settled, Miss Harrison. When can you start? The Circle M Ranch spread across a valley that seemed designed by nature to showcase the raw beauty of Nevada territory. Rolling grassland dotted with sage and wild lupine stretched toward distant mountains, while Willow Creek meandered through the property, providing the precious water that made cattle ranching possible in this harsh climate. Kate's first glimpse of her new workplace took her breath away, not just because of its natural beauty, but because it represented something she had never dared hope for, a place where she could build something lasting based on her own abilities. James, Mitchell's ranch house was constructed of local stone and timber, built to withstand the extremes of desert weather, while providing comfort for year-round living. The separate cottage he had mentioned sat about 100 yards from the main house, connected by a well-worn path that spoke of frequent but respectful communication between the two dwellings. It was larger than Kate had expected, with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that framed views of the surrounding countryside. "My late wife designed the cottage," James explained as he showed Kate around the property on her first morning. "Margaret believed that everyone deserved their own space, their own sense of home. She used it as her studio. She was quite an artist." Kate noticed that he spoke of his wife with warmth rather than the desperate grief that might have made her uncomfortable. Margaret Mitchell had been dead for 2 years, long enough for James to process his loss without forgetting his love for her. The ranch operation itself was more complex than Kate had anticipated. James ran approximately 300 head of cattle across grazing land that extended for several square miles, supported by a crew of 4 permanent cowboys and additional seasonal help during roundup and branding seasons. The business required detailed record-keeping of breeding schedules, health treatments, feed costs, and marketing arrangements that connected the Circle M to buyers as far away as San Francisco and Denver. The paperwork has been overwhelming. "Since Margaret died," James admitted as he showed Kate the ranch office, a small building adjacent to the main house that contained ledgers, correspondence files, and maps of the grazing areas. "She handled all the administrative work, kept everything organized in a way that made sense. Since then, I've been trying to manage the cattle and the business records, and neither is getting the attention it deserves." Kate studied the accumulated paperwork with the systematic approach she had learned from her teaching experience. The financial records were accurate but disorganized. Breeding information was scattered across multiple notebooks, and correspondence with buyers had fallen seriously behind schedule. "Mr. Mitchell," she said after reviewing the scope of the work, "this will take several weeks to reorganize properly. But once it's systematic, it should save you hours of work every week and probably improve your profit margins by helping you make better decisions about when and where to sell your cattle." James watched her sort through the chaotic records with obvious relief. "Miss Harrison, I have to admit I was skeptical about hiring someone without ranch experience, but watching you organize this mess in just one morning tells me I made the right decision." The work proved to be exactly what Kate had been hoping for, challenging enough to engage her mind fully, important enough to matter to the ranch's success, and varied enough to keep her learning constantly. She spent her mornings in the office, creating systematic records and catching up on correspondence. Afternoons often found her in the field with James, learning the practical aspects of cattle management while applying her organizational skills to improve efficiency. "You're a natural at this," James observed during her second week, as they worked together to vaccinate a group of calves. "Most people from back east take months to understand how cattle behave. You seem to read their moods instinctively." Kate felt a flush of pride at his words. "My grandfather always said that animals respond to confidence and calmness. If you're nervous or aggressive, they sense it immediately." "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," James said, then paused as if considering whether to ask a more personal question. "Miss Harrison, if you don't mind me asking, what brought you west in the first place? You clearly had education and opportunities back east." Kate had been dreading this question, knowing it would eventually come. How could she explain the mail-order bride arrangement without sounding desperate or foolish? How could she describe Henry Morrison's rejection without revealing the depth of her humiliation? "I came to Nevada to marry a rancher I had been corresponding with," she said simply, deciding that honesty was the best approach. "When I arrived, He decided that my Apache heritage made me unsuitable as a wife. The arrangement fell through, and I've been trying to build a new life ever since." James was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice carried anger, but not directed at her. "Any man who would reject a woman of your quality based on her bloodline is a fool who doesn't deserve the happiness he threw away." The simple declaration of support nearly brought tears to Kate's eyes. After months of having her worth questioned and diminished, James Mitchell's straightforward acceptance felt like a gift beyond measure. As weeks turned into months, Kate found herself settling into a routine that brought her more satisfaction than she had ever experienced. The work was demanding but rewarding, the living situation was comfortable and respectable, and James proved to be the kind of employer who appreciated competence and rewarded it with increasing responsibility. More importantly, she began to feel like she was building something permanent rather than merely surviving day to day. The ranch's improved record-keeping led to better breeding decisions, which produced higher quality cattle, which commanded better prices in distant markets. Her correspondence with buyers established relationships that expanded the ranch's opportunities beyond local sales. Every improvement she made strengthened both her position and her sense of belonging. The first real test of her new security came when James needed to travel to Carson City on business and asked her to manage the ranch in his absence. The responsibility was both thrilling and terrifying. 300 head of cattle, 4 cowboys, and thousands of dollars worth of equipment under her supervision for an entire week. "I wouldn't leave if I didn't trust you completely," James assured her before his departure. "You know this operation as well as I do now, and the men respect your judgment. You'll do fine." The week passed without major incident, but it was filled with dozens of small decisions that tested Kate's growing knowledge of ranch management. When a section of fence was damaged in a windstorm, she had to decide whether to repair it immediately or move the cattle to different pasture. When one of the cowboys reported signs of disease in part of the herd, she had to determine whether to call for veterinary help or treat the animals herself, using remedies she had learned from Dr. Hartwell. Each successful decision built her confidence and demonstrated to the ranch hands that she was capable of real leadership rather than merely administrative support. By the time James returned, the ranch was running more efficiently than it had before his departure. "The men tell me you handled everything perfectly," James said, as they reviewed the week's activities together. "More than perfectly, actually. You solved problems I didn't even know we had." Kate felt a deep sense of satisfaction at his words. "I've learned from an excellent teacher, Mr. Mitchell. You've given me opportunities I never expected to have." James studied her with an expression that seemed to contain more than professional appreciation. "Kate," he said, using her given name for the first time since she had started working for him, "I want you to know that this arrangement has exceeded all my expectations. You've not only solved my administrative problems, you've made improvements. I wouldn't have thought of myself." Kate felt her pulse quicken at the change in his tone, at the use of her first name, at the implication that their relationship was evolving beyond purely professional boundaries. "James," she replied, testing the sound of his name, "this position has given me something I've been searching for since I left Pennsylvania. The chance to prove my worth through my own efforts, rather than seeking approval from people who were determined to withhold it." The conversation hung in the air between them, laden with possibilities neither of them had spoken aloud. Kate had found meaningful work, financial security, and growing respect from the community of ranchers and businessmen who dealt with the Circle M. But she was also beginning to realize that she had found something else, the beginning of genuine affection with a man who valued her for exactly who she was. The question now was whether that affection could grow into something deeper, something that might finally give her the home and family she had dreamed of when she first stepped off the train in Cedar Falls. But this time, if love came, it would be built on a foundation of mutual respect and proven partnership rather than desperate hope and carefully crafted letters. 6 months into her employment at the Circle M Ranch, Kate Harrison had built a life that exceeded her wildest dreams. From those desperate days in Cedar Falls, she had meaningful work, financial independence, and the growing respect of the ranching community throughout Nevada territory. But she was about to discover that success could not entirely shield her from the prejudices she thought she had left behind. The confrontation came during the annual Cattlemen's Association meeting in Carson City, where ranchers from across the territory gathered to discuss market conditions, grazing rights, and territorial politics. James had invited Kate to accompany him as his business manager, a recognition of her expertise that filled her with professional pride. "You know more about our breeding records and market contracts than anyone," James had explained when he extended the invitation. "If we're going to negotiate new agreements with the railroad companies, I need your knowledge and analytical skills." The meeting was Kate's first exposure to the broader ranching community that extended beyond the immediate area around Cedar Falls. She found herself in rooms filled with successful businessmen who controlled thousands of head of cattle and wielded significant political influence throughout the territory. It was an intimidating environment, but also an exciting one, the kind of gathering where important decisions were made and careers could be advanced. For the first 2 days of the meeting, Kate's presence drew little attention. She sat quietly beside James during the formal sessions, taking detailed notes and occasionally whispering suggestions about market trends or contract terms that her organized records had revealed. Several ranchers complimented James on his improved business efficiency, clearly impressed by the systematic approach that Kate had brought to the Circle M's operations. The trouble began on the 3rd day, when Henry Morrison arrived with a delegation. From the Cedar Falls area, Kate spotted him across the crowded hotel lobby and felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. He looked older than she remembered, his hair grayer and his face more weathered, but his pale blue eyes still held the calculating coldness that had cut her so deeply 6 months earlier. Morrison noticed her at almost the same moment, his expression shifting from casual interest to shock and then to something approaching anger. He spoke quietly to the men around him, and Kate saw several heads turn in her direction with expressions of curiosity and disapproval. "Kate," James said quietly, appearing at her elbow, "is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Kate forced herself to stand straighter, drawing on the confidence she had built during her months at the ranch. "That's Henry Morrison," she said simply, "the rancher who rejected me when I first arrived in Nevada." James's expression darkened as he followed her gaze to where Morrison stood with his associates. "The fool who threw away his chance with you," he said, his voice carrying an edge of protective anger. "What's he doing here?" "He runs one of the larger operations around Cedar Falls," Kate replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "He has every right to be here. I just need to avoid him if possible." But avoiding Henry Morrison proved impossible in the confined space of the hotel's meeting rooms. During the afternoon session on railroad shipping rates, he approached the table where Kate and James were seated, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes holding unmistakable hostility. "Mitchell," Morrison said with forced politeness, nodding to James while pointedly ignoring Kate's presence. "I heard you've been making quite an impression with your improved record-keeping and market analysis." James stood to shake Morrison's offered hand, his manner courteous but cool. "The Circle M has had some good fortune with our business management, yes." Morrison's gaze shifted to Kate, and she saw recognition flicker in his pale eyes. "I don't believe I've been introduced to your—" Assistant, he said, the pause before the word assistant loaded with implication. This is Miss Harrison, James replied evenly. She manages all our business operations and correspondence. Her organizational skills have transformed our entire operation. Kate felt heat rise in her cheeks as Morrison studied her with the same calculating assessment she remembered from the train platform 6 months earlier. But this time, she refused to look away or show any sign of the intimidation he was clearly trying to project. Miss Harrison, Morrison repeated slowly, as if tasting the name. That's interesting. There was a woman by that name who caused quite a scandal in Cedar Falls earlier this year, a half-breed who tried to trap a respectable rancher into marriage through deception. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Kate felt the familiar burn of public humiliation beginning to rise in her chest. But alongside the embarrassment came something new. Anger at Morrison's attempt to diminish her accomplishments by dragging up the circumstances of their first meeting. "Mr. Morrison," Kate said clearly, her voice carrying to nearby tables where other ranchers had begun to listen with obvious interest. "I believe you're confusing the facts of our correspondence. I was completely honest about my heritage in every letter I wrote. The deception, if any occurred, was in your assumption that mixed heritage somehow didn't include Native American ancestry." Morrison's face flushed with anger at her direct response. "You deliberately misled me about your breeding, girl. Any decent woman would have been more specific about her background." James stepped forward, his body language shifting to something more protective and dangerous. "Mr. Morrison, I think you need to be very careful about how you speak to Miss Harrison. She's a valued member of my organization and deserves the same respect you'd show any other business professional." "Business professional?" Morrison's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Mitchell, surely you know what she really is. A half-breed trying to pass herself off as civilized, probably using the same tricks on you that she tried to use on me." The accusations sparked something cold and furious in Kate's chest. For 6 months, she had been building a life based on competence and genuine achievement. She had proven her worth through hard work and intelligent decision-making. She would not allow Henry Morrison to reduce all of that to crude speculation about her motives and character. "Mr. Morrison," she said, rising to her full height and meeting his gaze directly, "I think the difference between us is quite clear. I've spent the past 6 months proving my value through actual accomplishments. You've apparently spent the same time nursing wounded pride over a woman who was fortunate enough to escape marriage to someone of your character." A murmur ran through the nearby tables as other ranchers absorbed this exchange. Kate realized that she had just publicly confronted one of the more prominent cattlemen in the territory, challenging his version of events in front of his peers. Morrison's face went white with rage. "How dare you speak to me that way, you savage? I'll not be insulted by some Indian squaw who thinks she can buy respectability by keeping books for a lonely rancher." The slur hit Kate like a physical blow, but instead of crumbling under the attack, she felt something steel-hard crystallize in her chest. She had faced this kind of hatred before, had survived it and grown stronger. She would not allow Morrison to diminish her now, not when she had finally found her place in the world. "Mr. Morrison," she said with devastating calm, "the only savage behavior I see in this room is your inability to treat another human being with basic courtesy. As for respectability, I've learned that it can't be bought, inherited, or claimed through insults. It has to be earned through character and conduct, something you seem to have forgotten." James moved to stand beside Kate, his presence both supportive and protective. "Morrison, I think this conversation is over. Miss Harrison has conducted herself with more dignity than you've shown, and I won't stand by while you insult a member of my organization. Other ranchers were now openly watching the confrontation, some with disapproval of Morrison's behavior, others with the fascination that public conflicts always generated. Kate realized that this moment would define how she was perceived by the broader ranching community, as someone who could stand up for herself with dignity or as someone who would crumble under pressure. "Gentlemen," said a voice from behind them. The territorial delegate, Samuel Wright, approached their table with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to diffusing conflicts. "Perhaps we could return our attention to the business at hand. Personal disputes have no place in our professional discussions." Morrison looked around the room, apparently realizing that his attack on Kate had not generated the support he had expected. Several ranchers were looking at him with clear disapproval, more concerned with his breach of professional decorum than with Kate's heritage. "Of course," Morrison said stiffly. "I apologize for allowing personal matters to intrude on our business discussions." But his eyes, when they met Kate's, promised that this confrontation was far from over. As the formal session resumed, Kate found herself shaking slightly from the adrenaline of public confrontation. But alongside the physical reaction came a profound realization. She had stood up to Henry Morrison's attack and emerged with her dignity intact. More than that, she had done so in front of witnesses who could judge for themselves the character of both participants. James leaned close to whisper, "You handled that perfectly. Morrison just showed everyone in this room exactly what kind of man he is, and it wasn't flattering." Kate nodded, but she knew that the confrontation with her past was far from over. Morrison's presence at the meeting meant that the story of her rejection in Cedar Falls would spread throughout the territorial ranching community. The question now was whether her reputation for competence and professionalism would be strong enough to withstand the renewed scrutiny of her background and the circumstances that had brought her west. The evening after her confrontation with Henry Morrison, Kate found herself walking alone through the gardens behind the Carson City Hotel, trying to process the complex emotions that the day's events had stirred within her. The desert air was cool and fragrant with the scent of sage and night-blooming jasmine, but her mind was too turbulent to appreciate the peaceful setting. She had won her confrontation with Morrison. There was no doubt about that. The way other ranchers had looked at him after his crude outburst, the murmurs of disapproval that had followed his retreat from the meeting room, all confirmed that his attack on her had backfired spectacularly. But victory felt more complicated than she had expected. Kate. James's voice came from behind her, soft and concerned. She turned to see him approaching through the garden paths, his expression mixing relief and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "I needed some air," she said simply, not trusting herself to voice the more complex thoughts that were racing through her mind. James stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool evening. "Air. You were magnificent today," he said quietly. "The way you stood up to Morrison, the dignity you showed under attack. I've never seen anything like it." Kate felt heat rise in her cheeks at his praise. "I couldn't have done it without your support, knowing you were there, that you believed in me." She trailed off, suddenly aware that they were venturing into territory that had nothing to do with professional relationships. "Kate," James said, and something in his tone made her look up to meet his gaze directly. "What I felt today, watching Morrison try to tear you down, wasn't just professional concern. It was something much more personal." Kate's breath caught in her throat. She had sensed the growing attraction between them over the past months, had felt the way their working relationship was deepening into something that had nothing to do with cattle records or market analysis. But hearing him acknowledge it openly sent her heart racing with both excitement and fear. "James," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice the complex feelings that his nearness stirred within her. I know this complicates everything, he continued, stepping closer until she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I know that your position at the ranch, your reputation, everything you've built could be jeopardized if people think there's something improper between us. Kate nodded, understanding the social implications all too clearly. An unmarried woman working closely with a bachelor rancher was already the subject of speculation. Any hint of romantic involvement would provide ammunition for people like Morrison, who wanted to reduce her professional accomplishments to crude assumptions about her motives. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is merely respect for a valued employee, James said, his voice growing husky with emotion. Kate, I'm falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either connect their separate lives or collapse under the weight of social expectations and personal history. Kate felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that she was hearing the words she had dreamed of since she was old enough to understand what love meant. James, she whispered, reaching out to touch his face with trembling fingers. I love you too. I have for months, but I was afraid to admit it even to myself. His arms came around her then, pulling her close with a desperate tenderness that spoke of months of restrained longing finally given expression. When he kissed her, it was with the passion of a man who had discovered something precious beyond measure and the reverence of someone who understood how easily such treasures could be lost. Kate melted into his embrace, feeling for the first time in her life the safety and acceptance that came from being truly seen and valued by someone who loved her not despite her heritage, but because of everything that had shaped her into the woman she had become. Marry me, James whispered against her hair, the words both a question and a declaration. I know it will create challenges. I know people will talk, but I can't imagine my life without you in it. Kate pulled back to look into his eyes, seeing there the same mixture of love and determination that she felt in her own heart. Yes, she said simply, then smiled as joy flooded through her. Yes, James, I'll marry you. But even as they held each other in the moonlit garden, Kate's practical mind was already working through the implications of their decision. Marriage would change everything: her legal status, her social position, her relationship with the broader community that was just beginning to accept her professional competence. There will be people who say, I'm using you for social advancement, she said quietly, voicing one of her deepest fears. People like Morrison who will claim I manipulated you into marriage the same way they accused me of trying to trick him. James's arms tightened around her protectively. Let them talk. Anyone who knows us, who has seen how we work together, how we've built something real and valuable, will understand the truth. Our marriage will be based on genuine love and mutual respect, not on desperation or manipulation. Kate nodded, but she knew that the court of public opinion often cared more about gossip than truth. Her transformation from rejected mail order bride to successful businesswoman had been remarkable, but it was also the kind of story that invited cynical interpretation from people determined to see the worst in her motives. What about the ranch? She asked, another practical concern surfacing. If I become your wife instead of your employee, how will that change the working relationship we've built? James considered this seriously. It will change things, obviously, but I hope it will make us stronger partners, not weaker ones. You know more about the Circle M's operations than anyone except me. Marriage would give you a permanent stake in its success, a real voice in all the decisions that affect our future. The word "our" sent a thrill through Kate's chest. For the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, she was being offered not just acceptance or employment or even love, but true partnership in building something lasting and meaningful. They spent The next hour walking through the hotel gardens, talking through the practical details of their engagement and the wedding they would need to plan. James wanted to marry quickly, partly from eagerness to make their union official, but also from concern that delay would give their enemies more time to organize opposition. "We could marry right here in Carson City," he suggested. "The territorial judge could perform the ceremony, and we could have witnesses from the ranching community who respect your professional abilities." Kate liked the idea of marrying away from Cedar Falls, where her original humiliation had taken place. A wedding in the territorial capital would emphasize the new life she had built, rather than the circumstances that had driven her west. "I'd like Dr. Hartwell to be there if possible," Kate said. "She gave me my first real opportunity to prove myself, and she understood who I could become before I understood it myself." As they made their plans, Kate felt a deep sense of rightness settling over her. This wasn't the desperate grab for security that had motivated her response to Morrison's mail-order bride advertisement. This was a choice made from strength rather than weakness, based on genuine love and proven partnership rather than hope and carefully crafted letters. "There's something else we need to discuss," James said as they prepared to return to the hotel. "Children. If we're blessed with a family, our children will inherit your mixed heritage along with mine. They'll face some of the same challenges you've encountered." Kate had thought about this possibility many times during the past months, wondering if she had the right to bring children into a world that might judge them harshly for circumstances beyond their control. But looking into James's eyes, seeing the love and determination there, she felt confident that any children they raised would grow up knowing their worth, regardless of what others might think. "Our children will be loved and valued for exactly who they are," she said firmly. "They'll be raised to understand that their heritage, all of it, is something to be proud of, not something to apologize for." James smiled, and Kate could see that her response had answered concerns he hadn't quite known how to voice. "They'll be fortunate to have you as their mother," he said. "You'll teach them the kind of strength and dignity that can't be shaken by other people's prejudices." As they walked back toward the hotel, Kate felt as though she were floating rather than walking. The woman who had been publicly rejected and humiliated 6 months earlier was now engaged to a man who loved and respected her completely. The transformation seemed almost miraculous, but she knew it hadn't been magic that had brought her to this moment. It had been her own determination to define her worth through her actions rather than other people's opinions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word of their engagement spread through the ranching community. There would be gossip, speculation, and probably renewed attacks from people who couldn't accept the idea of a half-Apache woman marrying into territorial society's upper ranks. But tonight, walking hand in hand with the man she loved under the brilliant Nevada stars, Kate Harrison felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had brought her from the darkness of rejection to the light of genuine acceptance and love. The morning of Kate Harrison's wedding dawned clear and bright over Carson City, with the kind of crystalline Nevada sky that seemed to promise infinite possibilities. As she stood before the mirror in her hotel room, adjusting the simple but elegant blue dress that Dr. Hartwell had helped her select, Kate marveled at the woman looking back at her. The face was the same one that had pressed against the train window 8 months earlier, searching desperately for acceptance from a stranger. But everything else had changed. The eyes that met her reflection held confidence instead of desperation. The shoulders were straight with dignity rather than hunched with shame. The hands were steady and capable, bearing the calluses of honest work and the satisfaction of achievements earned through competence rather than charity. Kate Harrison was no longer a woman seeking to belong. She was a woman who had created her own place in the world through determination, intelligence, and the kind of strength that could only be forged in the fires of adversity. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. Dr. Hartwell entered, carrying a small bouquet of desert wildflowers that seemed to capture the raw beauty of the Nevada landscape in their purple and gold blooms. "From James," Dr. Hartwell said with a smile, handing Kate the flowers. "He picked them himself this morning from the hills above town. He said he wanted your wedding bouquet to represent the country that brought you together." Kate buried her face in the fragrant blooms, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. James understood that this land had been both cruel and kind to her, that it had tested her mercilessly, but also provided the opportunities she needed to discover her own worth. "Are you ready for this?" Dr. Hartwell asked, studying Kate's reflection with the keen observation of someone who had watched her transformation from desperate refugee to confident bride. Kate considered the question seriously. Was she ready to become Mrs. James Mitchell, to take on the responsibilities and challenges that would come with marriage to a prominent rancher? Was she prepared for the social scrutiny that would follow their union, the whispered speculations about her motives, and the renewed attacks on her character from people who could never accept her mixed heritage? "Yes," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm ready, not because I'm desperate for acceptance or security, but because I love James, and I believe we can build something meaningful together." The ceremony took place in the parlor of the Grand Hotel, with Territorial Judge William Patterson officiating and a small gathering of witnesses who represented the new life Kate had built in Nevada. Dr. Hartwell stood beside her as matron of honor, while Walter and Martha Jenkins had made the journey from their boarding house to celebrate the marriage of the young woman they had first sheltered when she had nowhere else to turn. Most significantly, several prominent ranchers from the Cattlemen's Association had chosen to attend, their presence serving as a public endorsement of Kate's character and James's judgment. These were men who had initially known her only through her work, who had come to respect her professional competence before learning about her personal history. Their attendance sent a clear message to the territorial community that Kate Mitchell would be accepted as a rancher's wife based on her proven abilities rather than rejected because of her ancestry. As James took her hand and they faced Judge Patterson together, Kate felt a profound sense of completion. This wasn't the fairy tale rescue she had once imagined, where a husband would solve all her problems and provide her with instant belonging. This was something far more valuable, a partnership between equals who had chosen each other from strength, rather than desperation, who had proven their compatibility through shared work and mutual respect before promising to share their lives. Do you, Catherine Harrison, take James Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? "I do," Kate said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. As she spoke the words, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The rejection that had nearly broken her spirit, the kindness that had helped her survive, the work that had rebuilt her confidence, and the love that had shown her what true acceptance meant. When James slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Kate felt something settle into place in her heart that had been missing her entire life. Not just love, though she loved him deeply, but the security that came from knowing she was valued exactly as she was, with all the complexity of her heritage and the strength she had built through adversity. The reception that followed was modest, but joyful, with toasts that celebrated not just the marriage, but Kate's remarkable transformation from rejected mail-order bride to respected businesswoman. Several ranchers made speeches praising her contributions to the territory's cattle industry, while Dr. Hartwell spoke movingly about the courage it took to rebuild one's life from nothing. But the most meaningful moment came when Walter Jenkins rose to speak, his weathered face serious as he looked around the assembled guests. "I've known Kate since the morning she had nowhere to sleep but a train station platform," he said quietly. "I've watched her transform herself from a woman who had been told she didn't belong anywhere into someone who belongs everywhere she chooses to plant her roots. That kind of strength doesn't come from luck or charity. It comes from character. James Mitchell is getting more than a wife today. He's getting a partner who's already proven she can build something from nothing." As the celebration continued, around them, Kate and James found themselves standing together on the hotel's veranda, looking out over the Nevada landscape that had witnessed both her darkest moments and her greatest triumphs. "Do you ever regret how everything happened?" James asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. "The rejection, the hardship, the long path that brought you here?" Kate considered the question carefully. 8 months ago, she would have said that she regretted everything about her western journey except its eventual outcome. Now, with the wisdom that came from having overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, she understood that her suffering had been an essential part of her transformation. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret any of it. The rejection forced me to discover my own strength. The hardship taught me what I was capable of surviving. The work showed me what I could accomplish when given the opportunity. Even Henry Morrison's cruelty served a purpose. It showed me the difference between seeking acceptance and demanding respect." James smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. "You're not the same woman who stepped off that train in Cedar Falls." "No," Kate agreed, leaning into his embrace. "That woman was looking for someone to rescue her, to give her a place in the world through marriage. I'm not looking for rescue anymore. I'm looking for partnership with someone who sees my value and wants to build something together." As the weeks following their wedding passed, Kate discovered that her new status as Mrs. James Mitchell brought both opportunities and challenges she hadn't fully anticipated. On the positive side, marriage to a respected rancher had elevated her social position considerably. Wives of other prominent cattlemen began including her in their social gatherings, and her opinions on business matters carried additional weight in community discussions. But the elevation in status also brought increased scrutiny. Every decision she made, every social interaction, every aspect of her behavior was examined for signs that she was either putting on airs above her station or failing to live up to the standards expected of a rancher's wife. It was a delicate balance that required all the diplomatic skills she had developed during her months of proving herself in hostile environments. The most significant test came when she and James were invited to a formal dinner hosted by the territorial governor in honor of visiting investors from San Francisco. Kate understood that this invitation represented both recognition of James's growing influence in the cattle industry and acceptance of her as a suitable companion for such high-level social events. She prepared for the evening with meticulous care, selecting a dress that was fashionable but not ostentatious, practicing conversations that would demonstrate her intelligence without appearing to compete with the men who would dominate the business discussions. When they arrived at the governor's mansion, she felt confident but not complacent, knowing that a single social misstep could undo months of careful reputation building. The evening proved to be a triumph that exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Kate found herself seated between a banker from Sacramento and a railroad executive from San Francisco, both of whom were impressed by her knowledge of cattle markets and transportation logistics. When the conversation turned to the challenges of doing business in Nevada territory, she was able to contribute insights based on her experience with remote mining camps and isolated ranching communities. "Mrs. Mitchell," the railroad executive said as the evening wound down, "your husband is fortunate to have a business partner with such comprehensive understanding of territorial commerce. Have you considered expanding your consulting work beyond the cattle industry?" Kate felt a thrill of professional recognition at his words. The idea of developing her business skills into a broader consulting practice was both exciting and daunting, but it represented the kind of opportunity that would have been unimaginable during her desperate first days in Nevada. As they traveled back to the Circle M after the dinner, Kate reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. She had gone from being a woman that polite society refused to acknowledge to someone whose opinions were sought by territorial leaders and visiting investors. The change hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been built on the foundation of genuine accomplishment rather than social maneuvering or lucky connections. The ranch itself continued to prosper under their joint management. Kate's systematic approach to record-keeping and market analysis had increased their profits by nearly 30% in the first year of their marriage, while James's expertise in cattle breeding and range management ensured that their herd remained healthy and productive. They had become true partners in every sense of the word, with decisions made jointly and responsibilities shared according to their respective strengths. More importantly, their marriage had deepened into the kind of enduring love that Kate had dreamed of but never quite believed was possible for someone with her complicated background. James never made her feel like she needed to apologize for her heritage or downplay her abilities to make him comfortable. Instead, he encouraged her to embrace all aspects of her identity and to continue developing her professional skills. 1 year after their wedding, Kate discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy, but also with familiar anxieties about how her child would be received in a world that still struggled to accept people of mixed heritage. Would her son or daughter face the same challenges she had encountered? Would they grow up feeling like they needed to choose between different aspects of their identity? "Our child will be loved completely," James assured her when she voiced these concerns. "They'll grow up knowing that their heritage, all of it, is something to be proud of. They'll learn from your example that worth comes from character and accomplishment, not from other people's approval." Kate found comfort in his words and in the realization that her child would grow up in circumstances vastly different from her own childhood. They would have two parents who loved each other and worked together as equals. They would have financial security and educational opportunities. Most importantly, they would have the example of a mother who had overcome seemingly impossible obstacles to build a life of dignity and purpose. As Kate stood on the porch of the ranch house one evening, watching the sun set over the Nevada landscape that had become her true home, she thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived in this territory. That desperate, frightened person seemed like a stranger now, someone whose fears and limitations she could barely remember experiencing. The transformation hadn't been magical or immediate. She had been shaped by months of hard work, by the kindness of people like the Jenkins family and Dr. Hartwell, by the respect she had earned from the mining community and the ranching industry, and by the love of a man who saw her value when she was still learning to see it herself. But most importantly, she had been transformed by her own refusal to accept other people's definitions of her worth. She had insisted on proving herself through competence rather than seeking acceptance through submission. She had chosen to build her own place in the world, rather than waiting for someone to offer her one. Kate Harrison Mitchell was no longer the mail-order bride who had been rejected for her Apache heritage. She was a successful businesswoman, a respected member of territorial society, a beloved wife, and soon to be a mother. She had found her true worth, not in spite of her mixed heritage, but because of everything that heritage had taught her about strength, survival, and the courage to define herself on her own terms. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain, and Kate smiled as she felt her unborn child move within her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but she would meet them with the confidence of a woman who had already proven that she could overcome anything the world chose to throw at her. She had come west, seeking acceptance, and had found something far more valuable, the unshakable knowledge that she belonged wherever her courage and competence could take her. It was a lesson she would pass on to her children, and they to theirs, ensuring that the strength she had built from adversity would echo through generations yet to come. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, brilliant points of light in the vast Nevada darkness. Each one reminded Kate of a possibility, a dream that could be achieved through determination and hard work. She had reached for her own star and claimed it not through luck or rescue, but through the kind of persistent effort that transformed impossible dreams into inevitable realities. Kate Harrison Mitchell had found her place in the world by refusing to accept that she didn't deserve one. It was the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.